In an old cemetery between Bellefontaine and Indian Lake, Ohio, there's a very old grave marker that sticks out from the rest. It isn't much different from the other obelisks that shadow the places where those who once stood among the living now rest, save an inscription on its side that reads, "Was murdered near Lewistown Reservoir. There the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary be at rest." Job 3:17. Encountering this stone for the first time, one might wonder what could have happened to this poor soul that drove those left behind to mark the incident in such a way. Most stones just contain a name, some dates, and perhaps a quote of some verse or poem. But how many label that the deceased was murdered? Walking around, the name Sarah Alice Laughlin is engraved on the south-facing side along with the date of September 22, 1875, and her age, just 16 years old. Who was she? Who murdered her? It was these questions that drove me to spend the summer and fall of 2016 diving into history. The answers would shock me as I uncovered them, and the whole experience would light a fire inside me for discovering lost history. Welcome to Season 2 of The Long Way Home. I'm your host, Josh Bearheart Hawk. In this episode, we're digging into a story lost to time, barely remembered outside the walls of a county historical society. This was the tale that started me on the path I'm still walking nearly a decade later, and I'm excited to share the history and the process of uncovering it with you. So buckle your seatbelt and lean back as we take a drive down dusty back roads and open freeways. The destination isn't really important, it's all about the journey, and the journey is so much better when you take the long way home. It was the summer of 2016, and I was just starting to get into making YouTube videos. I'd always had a love for the macabre, and that summer I decided I would spend some time visiting cemeteries and filming whatever I found. Truth be told, I was hoping to find ghosts or something spooky, but I didn't expect to uncover anything too interesting. I spent hours driving around, mostly on weekends, and often with my father as we shared a passion for all things supernatural. Along the way, I was filming on my phone and using an outdated version of Windows Movie Maker to put together some rudimentary videos. The sound quality was awful, and the end product was nothing I'm particularly proud of, especially considering what I do nowadays for a living. But the fun was in making memories and doing something new. On one particularly hot day in July, my father, one of his friends, and myself had spent the majority of the day in eastern Ohio, mainly driving around Logan County and the surrounding area, and we were only 1 or 2 stops away from calling it a day. Taking a turn onto another back road, we stumbled down an old cemetery that seemed like the perfect spot to end the day. As we spread out, each taking in the place in our own time and way, I was impressed at the age of some of the stones. Many of them were from the 19th century, and while there were some that had fallen victim to time, the whole place was in better shape than I expected it to be. After a few minutes of looking around, I heard my name being called from across the grounds and made my way over to see what the fuss was all about. My father had found what would turn out to be a mystery. Nothing stood out at first glance. It was just another obelisk with a name on it. The girl was young, but dying young wasn't really that uncommon in the 1870s. Walking around to the side he was pointing me to, I found the inscription I mentioned in the opening. Was murdered near Lewistown Reservoir. There the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary be at rest. Job 3:17. In the dozens, or maybe even hundreds of cemeteries I'd visited, I'd never seen a headstone like that. To tell the whole world the person laying below was murdered seemed like such an odd thing. It's more typical to remember their life, things they loved and who they were, than to remember how they died. Taking a step back, I knew there was a story I needed to tell. I assumed it would be one that had been told before, that someone else had found the stone before me. I would quickly discover, however, that I was very wrong. Over the next several weeks, I would spend hours combing the internet for information. With the help of my father, who did a huge amount of research and even reached out to the Logan County Historical Society to get any information they had on the case, I was able to piece together most of the sad tale. I put together a mini documentary for YouTube, but it didn't really live up to what I wanted it to be. I was still very new to video editing and YouTube in general, and the final product would bug me until I made the decision in 2022 to remake it. It was around that time that I started really leaning into history and how to research it properly. I spent hours on sites like newspapers.com and Ancestry, just finding all I could and making sure I had as many details as I could get. To this day, that's still one of my favorite parts of putting my Legends and Tales series together. Even researching more well-known stories leads me to information I'd never heard before, and I try to find at least one fact or bit of information to share that hasn't been shared in other versions. With the story of Sarah Alice Laughlin, it was all new. With the exception of a small amount of information the Historical Society had, no one else had shared the story anywhere online. There were references in old newspapers that had since been digitized, but in the most simple way, her story had been lost to time. The remake of the documentary for YouTube was good, and I'm still proud of what I put together, but I want to share it in other ways as well. It's become a very personal story to me over the years, and it will always hold a special place in my heart. If not for the story of Allie uncovering my love for discovering history, I wouldn't have found my passion for storytelling, and I doubt I would have written any of my books, or pushed as hard to learn how to research, film, edit, or any of the other things I've spent the past few years getting better at. So today, I'm sharing another version with you. A version that comes from my very first Legends and Tales book, and tells the story in the way it was meant to be told all along. Are you enjoying The Long Way Home? If you like these true tales of love and loss, you're going to enjoy my books. For those who don't know, I'm also an author of fictional works covering horror and mystery. My debut novel, The Journal, released in 2023, and follows the story of a man named Josh who works to uncover the mystery of what happened to a private detective named Heath in the 1960s. As the story unfolds, Josh finds himself in a mystery of his own as he realizes he hasn't had contact with anyone in days, except some strange entity that seems to be trying to send him a message. I won't spoil the ending, but you'll find there's much more to the story than meets the eye. Legends and Tales, creepy and fun stories to tell around the campfire, is a compilation of short horror stories, both true and fictional, all written by me and released in the fall of 2023. It's perfect for those nights around the campfire and includes tales like An Unwelcome Guest, where a detective meets a demon who wants to take him for a ride. It also has several stories ripped straight from Ohio legends, like One More Ride, a new twist on the tale of the headless motorcyclist out of Elmore, Ohio. GPS Signal Lost came out in early 2024, and it follows the tale of Charlie Wood. Charlie was mostly an average guy with a soon-to-be ex, wife, and kids who barely noticed how often he wasn't home. Spending his time trucking across the United States, he longed for a different life. A bathroom break in New Mexico would jumpstart that new life when he emerged from taking a dump to find the world void of life. Or at least it seemed to be. Before long, he found himself in the company of a mannequin named Lisa, a stuffed dinosaur named Kyle, and a creepy statue of Bigfoot called Steven. It was all weird enough to start, but when his new friends start taking on a life of their own, it gets even weirder. All three of my books can be found on Amazon or my website, joshbearhartlegendsandtales.com, and they're just waiting for you to get lost in their unique worlds. But that's enough about me. Let's get back to the dirt road we were traveling down. September 22nd, 1875 dawned like any other day in the small town of Bellefontaine, Ohio. Bathed in beautiful fall weather, Sarah Alice Laughlin was eagerly anticipating a day of picking plums and walnuts with the family of one of her father's farmhands. Bright and early, James Shell arrived at the farmhouse, accompanied by his wife Melinda and their three young children. They had rented a wagon the previous day, and their excitement was palpable. Esther, the eldest Shell daughter, was particularly thrilled to see Allie, whom she admired as a role model and almost considered the big sister she never had. Esther had invited Allie over the night before to get an earlier start, but Allie had declined, citing chores that needed to be done. James left the wagon to fetch Allie, returning with her shortly afterward. Once everyone was settled in, they headed towards their destination, the Lewistown Reservoir, known in the modern era as Indian Lake. Arriving at the reservoir around noon, the small group laid out the food they had packed for their afternoon meal, enjoying lunch before starting their task of picking walnuts from nearby trees. After a while, James and Allie headed over to a neighboring thicket to collect plums. They were gone for a couple of hours, and James eventually returned to the wagon alone. What happened next is difficult to ascertain due to conflicting reports. Melinda claims that James returned without Allie, chillingly informing her that he had killed the girl. James, on the other hand, says he and Allie were separated while picking plums, and he was surprised to find her absent upon returning to the wagon. Regardless of the truth, Melinda rushed back to the Laughlin farm to inform Josiah that Allie was missing, while James hurried to nearby houses to gather people for a search party. By the time Josiah arrived at the reservoir, the search had already begun, with dozens combing the woods. More and more searchers joined in, looking through the night. In the early morning hours of September 23rd, they discovered the body of Sarah Alice Laughlin. Partially nude, she had been stabbed 13 times and suffered a fractured skull. James was promptly arrested and taken to the Logan County Jail in Bellefontaine, where a coroner's inquest was assembled to ascertain the cause of death and pinpoint the perpetrator. The investigation began on the afternoon of the 23rd, and details of what was transpiring inside the courthouse began to filter through the growing crowd outside. As more information emerged, the atmosphere became increasingly charged, with rumblings of hanging James growing louder. The sheriff managed to pacify the crowd that night, but his confidence in his ability to contain them much longer was waning. Throughout the day on the 24th, the crowd's size and hostility swelled as the inquest dragged on. In a desperate bid to defuse the situation, the sheriff approached James, offering to smuggle him out of the city if he would confess his guilt. James rebuffed this offer, vehemently maintaining his innocence and instead accusing Melinda of the crime. By the evening, the crowd outside the courthouse had swelled to nearly 1,000 men, organizing into groups, including those brandishing a hefty railroad tie to use as a battering ram if needed. Around 11 p.m., the mob's self-appointed leader pounded on the courthouse door, demanding entry. When the sheriff didn't respond, the group with the railroad tie swung into action, breaking down the door and surging inside. They tied up the sheriff and his deputies before forcing their way further into the jail, destroying several doors as they searched. Finally, they located James Shell's cell and began working to free him. As the mob struggled to reach James, their leader emerged from the courthouse to announce to the frenzied crowd, "We've got him, and we will bring him out and make him confess to this and other crimes." Moments later, they emerged, James in their grasp, and ushered him to the south corner of the courthouse, where a tree loomed large enough to hang him. A debate ensued among the crowd about whether to hang James on the spot or grant him a chance to speak. Ultimately, the decision was made to allow him to talk, largely driven by the mob's conviction that James was guilty of multiple murders and a desire to pin other crimes on him. When questioned about what happened to Allie, James claimed that Melinda had masterminded the murder out of jealousy. He recounted that he had once bought candy for the young girl, igniting Melinda's hatred and leading her to believe he intended to leave her for Allie. The mob's leader relentlessly accused James of other crimes, including another prior murder, all of which James steadfastly denied. They circled back to the subject of Allie, to which James finally exclaimed, "Do you suppose I'd do such a thing? Mr. Laughlin was my best friend." Recognizing that there was nothing more to be said, they asked him about his final wishes for his body. James requested to be buried beside his son, who had died years earlier, and asked that the word be sent to his parents, assuring him that he died a free man, innocent of the crime. His final words, uttered as a prayer, were reportedly, "I hope the Lord will have mercy on me and all of you." The crowd watched in grim silence as the box he was standing on was kicked away and he dangled, lifeless, for the next half hour. As the sun began to rise, the crowd slowly dispersed. The sheriff, untied at last, emerged to cut James's body down. The investigation into Allie's death persisted after the hanging. Melinda was repeatedly interrogated, and Esther Shell provided testimony about the day's events. The coroner's examination of Allie's remains revealed strands of hair clutched tightly in her fist. The hair, 10 to 14 inches long and lighter than James's, seemed to match Melinda's. Melinda was subsequently arrested as an accomplice, but was eventually released with the charges being dropped. After September 1875, Melinda vanished from public view, leaving no trace of her whereabouts or the fate of her children. One peculiar article from 1902 mentions a Charles Martin arriving in Bellefontaine, claiming to be James's son and requesting to see his father's jail cell. He vanished before he could do so, sparking speculation of an attempted scam. Details about this incident remain elusive and uncertain. So, who truly killed Sarah Alice Laughlin? I personally believe that Melinda was involved in some capacity, though James's innocence is not clear-cut either. Even if he acted alone, he was entitled to a fair trial and a lawful sentence, not the brutal execution of mob justice. The truth remains that Allie's life was tragically cut short, and the ripple effects were profound. The Shell children lost their father and, in essence, their mother. The Laughlins lost a daughter and a sister. The lingering mystery continues to cast a shadow over the memory of those whose lives were forever altered by the events of that fateful day. So that's the story of Sarah Alice Laughlin, based on newspaper reports and accounts from the time. The concept of mob justice was a hot-button issue in the 19th century, and the story of what happened to James resonated almost as much as Allie's tale. Some were of the mind that people like James got what they deserved, assuming guilt with no real evidence needed. Others insisted that the rule of law should prevail, arguing that the life of even one innocent man being saved was worth the risk of 100 guilty men going free. Many of these stories I dig into have at least some of that element of justice. When bad things happen, most want to see someone pay for their crimes in some way. Whether it's a disaster like that of the Ashtabula train crash or the slaughter of an innocent young woman, the public is seldom satisfied with anything less than blood. As Season 2 of The Long Way Home rolls on, I'm going to be sharing a lot of stuff like this, going in depth on tales I share over on YouTube. Over there on my channel, Legends and Tales, I share stories like this one from all over the United States. It's something I've been doing for a few years now, among other projects, and I'm excited to grow it as I move forward through 2025 and beyond. This podcast is going to be an extension of that series, diving deeper into stories and tales, sharing stuff that just doesn't fit into the YouTube video format. Subscribing on YouTube will bring both Legends and Tales and The Long Way Home to your feed whenever new episodes drop, and The Long Way Home on its own is available wherever you prefer to listen to podcasts. Some of the upcoming episodes here on The Long Way Home will be tied to older episodes of Legends and Tales, but newer stuff will be coming as well over the course of the season. As always, make sure to follow and rate The Long Way Home, no matter where you choose to listen. You can check out my books on Amazon or at joshbearhartlegendsandtales.com and even send me a message on select podcasting platforms. I want to thank all of you for joining me on this drive. Remember, the destination isn't as important as the journey, and the journey is always better when you take the long way home.